Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Set the Line podcast. As always, I'm Sam Calder, joined by the ultimate setter of the line himself, Braden Hoover.
I gotta fix these shadow issues here sometime because I don't know if you can see on my screen, but it looks like I have a crease in my forehead here.
Yeah, I can see that a little bit. Yeah, like you got a little indent.
I've been noticing that in the TikTok clips I've been doing. So maybe we'll be moving to a new location after this one.
Yeah, well, you got that. My forehead looks like the sun right now with the amount of glistening I've got going on. Looks like I just went to the tanning salon or something like that. My goodness.
Yeah, it looks great though. Your skin looks just absolutely beautiful.
I appreciate that. I've been working on my glow recently, so I'm happy to hear you say that.
But put me on a moisturizer or something.
Seriously, I'll get you on with my skincare routine. Don't worry.
All right, perfect.
But we are back today with part one of our Dynasty wide receiver rankings. We will have part two coming out probably early next week, I would imagine, so stay tuned for that. But in this episode, we will have our wide receivers 24 through 13, and then 12 through number 1 in part 2. But Braden, unless you have more info to further the ado, I say we get things rolling here.
I'm 100% for it.
Let's do it. Kick us off, Braden, with your wide receiver 24.
As my wide receiver 24, I'm going to go with Christian Watson of the Green Bay Packers. Now, obviously, we have a little bit of a changing of the guard at quarterback for Green Bay this year, going from Aaron Rodgers to Jordan Love, but I think that's going to be a boost for Christian Watson because Rodgers kind of had a penchant for his old buddies, threw a lot to Allen Lazard, threw a decent amount to Randall Cobb, probably more than he should have. So Watson is now clearly the wide receiver one in this Green Bay room. You know, they have Jaden Reed. They brought in a couple of tight ends in the draft. They have two really good running backs. But I think out of all players, from a dynasty perspective, the guy you're going to want the most in this offense is Christian Watson. Last year had just 66 targets for 41 catches, but was extremely efficient with those. 14.9 yards per catch, 7 touchdowns. Also had 7 carries for 80 yards and 2 touchdowns. So a little bit of a threat in the jet sweep game as well. And if you go back to week 1, he probably could have had another 75 yards and another touchdown because against Minnesota, had a deep ball perfectly placed and dropped it for his first career target. Bounced back from it really well. He's a very, very good player. And I think in a new kind of, I don't know if I would say new offensive scheme, but new look offense, I think he's going to be a really, really nice piece.
Yeah, I like that. I'm a little bit higher on Watson. I have him as my wide receiver 17. But I agree absolutely that of the Packers offense, he's the guy that you want. He has the prototypical size and speed that you look for in a wide receiver. He's 6'5", 208, and runs a sub 4.40. 4.40, speaking of which, that's quite a mouthful if you really think about it. I mean, that can be a tongue twister if you have to say that 5 times fast.
4.40, 4.40, 4.40, 4.40, 4.40.
All right, maybe you're just, you can get things rolling off the tongue a little better than I can. But
I'm not sure about that, but who knows?
But yeah, I mean, he's a freakish athlete and showcased that last year. And I think this year in a Packers offense that will probably be slightly more run-heavy with a new quarterback in Jordan Love, I think that's going to set up the deep ball really well, and I think that's where Christian Watson's going to get a lot of his work. Saw last season, had 8 touchdowns in a 4-game span. Would not surprise me at all if he puts up 8 touchdowns again this season, but I would expect that to be, certainly in a wider spread than that. And I think that, looking to next year even a little bit, I think that this Packers offense could be really good. And then, like we mentioned earlier, Christian Watson is the guy you want. So I think he's set up really well for a bright future in Green Bay, which pains me to say a little bit as a Vikings fan.
Yeah, I think we talked about it a little bit when we did quarterbacks, where regardless of what happens with Jordan Love in Green Bay, the Packers are going to have a good quarterback at some point because it's going to be very hard for this team to be average. Either Jordan Love is going to be good and, they'll be a team that's, at least contending for the playoffs every season. Great for Christian Watson's fantasy value. Or if he just flat out sucks, they're likely going to replace him in the draft, whether that's this year, whether that's next year. And, if they're drafting high enough up, they're going to get somebody who's good.
Yeah. Screw the Packers, though. That's all that matters.
Agreed.
My wide receiver 24 is Jahan Dotson. And with Jahan Dotson, the last 5 weeks of the season, He actually out-targeted Terry McLaurin. Take it as you will. It's a very small sample size, but still impressive nonetheless. And I think with Washington, obviously you have Eric Bieniemy coming in as the new offensive coordinator. But on top of that, if the Sam Howell experiment fails, Washington is going to be picking very high in the draft. And if you've been living under a rock, the 2024 quarterback class is quite good. So a lot to feel good about there if that is the case. But even if that's not the case, you've got your quarterback for the future, which we cannot say about Washington for quite some time. So I think Jahan Dotson has a very big year 2 breakout ahead of him. He's only 23 years old, was a first rounder last year. And I think that he's going to have a very nice year in this Eric Bieniemy offense.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of Jahan Dotson too. I wasn't really super high on him coming into the draft last year, but he's changed my mind a little bit. Had over 600 yards as a rookie, over 500 yards as a rookie in a pretty bad passing offense. Who used, was it 3 or 4 quarterbacks? Because I know it was Wentz for a little bit. It was Howell at the end of the year. I think there was somebody in between too, right?
Would have been Taylor Heineke.
Yeah. So with some consistency, I think he's going to be a really, really nice player. However, I think he's just outside of my top 24 right now. I've got him as my wide receiver 26, so just missing the cut for this video, or I guess podcast, depending on where you're listening or watching, because I will put this one up on YouTube. I won't forget this time. So, Jahan Dotson is a guy I would love to be buying right now.
Yep. And yeah, I think, each of us had a couple of startups recently. And I think I ended up with him in one, and you ended up with him in one.
Mm-hmm. I think so, yeah. And I've got him in another startup I did this offseason too, I want to say. Is that right?
So,
I don't know. I hope it's right.
But yeah, Jahan Dotson, I think, is a guy who's got a very bright future ahead.
Moving on, as my wide receiver 23, I've got DJ Moore here, which maybe is a little bit underrated compared to the consensus, but DJ Moore has just never been a guy who's going to be, a top 12 wide receiver for me. He had 888 yards last year on a ridiculous target volume, 118 targets, only had 63 catches and 7 touchdowns, but he's just never a big touchdown guy, and that's the thing that really holds him back. Last year, his 7 touchdowns, nearly double his previous career high of 4. So he seems like a guy who is not going to be getting more than 5 touchdowns a year. I don't know if going from a Panthers offense to a Bears offense, which, it should be better, but it's not going to be super elite this year, I don't think, is going to help him a ton. And at the same time, he's 26 already, which is not super old for receivers, but compared to some of these other guys in this list, I just don't think he has the upside to pass those guys.
Yeah, I agree with that. I've got DJ Moore as my wide receiver 22, so just one spot ahead of you there. And you mentioned his touchdowns. His 7 touchdowns were a career high, like you mentioned, 4 being his previous career high. And did so last year on just 63 catches, which was his lowest total since his rookie season in 2018, where he had 55. He's consistently a wide receiver 2 in fantasy, has been for the past 4 years. And, everything you hear in OTAs and camp right now is everything all right over there?
Can you hear that in the background?
I can. The dogs are barking.
Yeah, you get the garbage truck outside right now.
So sure. That'll do it.
He's a little bit excited.
But anyways, everything you hear right now in camp and OTAs with DJ Moore is that his chemistry with Justin Fields is incredible for the very small amount of time that they've had together. So that's a very promising sign. And, considering what DJ Moore's been able to do with very lackluster quarterback play in the past, gives me optimism that he's going to take a small step up this year.
Yeah, I think DJ Moore is going to be, better as an NFL receiver than a fantasy receiver, I think.
Yeah.
And part of that is the Bears seem to not want to throw the ball a ton. Obviously, it's because last year their wide receiver corps was dreadful, to say the least. And then this year you bring in DJ Moore, and you expect a little bit of growth in Justin Fields, so maybe a little bit more passing. But who knows what the volume is going to look like. There's just a lot of concerns with that, which is why I'm a little bit hesitant to put DJ Moore higher than 23 on my list.
Yeah.
Are you still holding on to him in our St. Thomas Dynasty League right now? Or did you trade him? I can't remember.
DJ Moore, I traded him. I traded him
Okay.
for a first and Keontae Ingram.
Okay.
So I like that value, though. I think that's a fair trade.
Yeah, I think so too. I think that that should be like a mid first at least too, right?
Yeah, it'll probably be right in that mid first round range, I would anticipate.
Yeah, I'd say it's pretty fair value for both sides then.
Yeah, I wasn't mad at it at all. My wide receiver 23 is a guy who I think is extremely underrated given the amount of volume that he has gotten and just his talent in general, and that's Michael Pittman. If we look at his quarterbacks that have been throwing him the football over the past 3 seasons that he entered his career, it's been an old Philip Rivers, who as of today is expecting his 10th child, Carson Wentz, Matt Ryan, Sam Ellinger, and Nick Foles. Not exactly elite quarterback play. And, the volume might not necessarily be there this season in what I anticipate to be a very run-heavy offense with Anthony Richardson and Jonathan Taylor. But at the same time, I think that's going to set up a lot more one-on-one opportunities because you're going to have a lot more guys stacking the box to defend the run. And I think that's where Michael Pittman is going to benefit tremendously, considering he is 6'4", 220. He had 141 targets last season, which is just absurd. 99 catches. The problem with Michael Pittman, though, and kind of like what we just mentioned with DJ Moore, he's not a touchdown guy. In 46 career games since he entered the league, he has just 11 touchdowns, with his career high being 6 in 2021. So if he can find the end zone, I think, quite honestly, he has the potential to be a future wide receiver 1 in fantasy. And on top of that, he's entering a contract year. So at the very worst, he goes somewhere else where he'll get, probably more work in a more pass-heavy offense. Or the Colts bring him back for a lot of money, and they're basically forced to throw him the ball as a wide receiver 1.
Yeah, to me, Pittman's another one of those guys where his real life value is going to be a lot higher than his fantasy value right now. Because looking at rookie quarterbacks, especially guys like Anthony Richardson, who I think one of his similar comps would be Justin Fields in terms of like a fantasy perspective.
Yeah.
He really hurts wide receivers out of the gate, especially as a rookie. And I don't see Pittman being a guy you want to start consistently for the next probably 1 to 2 years if you're a contending team. So Pittman is just outside of my top 24 as well, down at wide receiver 27 for me. I think he's a phenomenal player, and I think we've seen that from his on-field performance. But there's just too many lingering concerns about what that offense is going to look like, what we're going to see from Anthony Richardson, what Shane Steichen's going to want to do. And with Jonathan Taylor being there as well, the Colts don't really have to, force feed Michael Pittman the ball. So, a lot of question marks for me.
Yeah, and the other thing that I forgot to mention too is, I see 2 outcomes this year for Michael Pittman. I think it's either he gets very little volume in a run-heavy offense, or he basically plays the A.J. Brown role in the Shane Steichen offense, and he gets, 100-plus targets and 10 touchdowns. I think it's probably going to be somewhere in the middle, quite honestly. But the number 1 rule in Dynasty is bet on the player over the situation, and I think this is a good example of that.
Yeah, I 100% agree. So I think Pittman's a decent buy right now if you can get him for less than like a late first, I would say. I would probably pay a late first, like 110, 111 if need be.
Yeah.
But if you can get him for anything less than that, you pounce on that opportunity. There's going to be people that are panicking and trying to sell him. If you have him, he's a hold for sure. Don't sell him off right now.
Absolutely.
As my wide receiver 22, I'm going to go with Chris Godwin of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. We've got a common theme down here at the bottom of this list so far, where it's guys who are really talented players, but have iffy situations for sure. And Chris Godwin, no exception. Tom Brady's been replaced by one or both of Baker Mayfield and Kyle Trask, and we are almost certainly going to see a decrease from his 1,023 yards and 104 receptions last season.
Yeah.
However, he only did have 3 touchdowns last year. So I would assume that can't go down anymore, right? At least
You would think.
It might go up. I don't think the Bucs are going to be that bad with Baker or Kyle Trask leading the offense, and they are going to run the ball a little bit more. So maybe that'll work out, maybe it won't. Mike Evans, probably in his last year as a Tampa Bay Buccaneer, I would think. So Godwin is likely going to be their wide receiver 1 for the foreseeable future, and he's definitely the wide receiver 1 from a fantasy perspective to have from this team. I think that Godwin is a guy, like, I've been trying to buy him a little bit in a couple of leagues. He's 27. He's probably got, I'd say, 2 to 3 years left as an elite wide receiver. Perfect if you're just entering a championship window. If it's starting to close a little bit, maybe I'd be a little bit concerned. And if you're in a rebuild, obviously sell him now, because by the time you're good, he's not going to be, a meaningful asset, I don't think. But as of right now, he's my wide receiver 22 in Dynasty.
Yeah, you mentioned the age as a slight concern. I am not quite as high on Chris Godwin as you are. You've had a couple guys outside of your top 24 that I've had, and this is the first guy in your top 24 that I don't have. And I have Chris Godwin as my wide receiver 33. Now,
Oh, whoa.
yeah, he's a little bit down there for me. The reason being the age, like we mentioned. He's going to be 28 years old at the start of next season. But the one thing that I will say Godwin has in favor is, well, actually two. Evans's situation being the first, and the second being kind of the same thing that we mentioned with Jahan Dotson, of either one of Mayfield or Trask emerges as a starting quarterback, or the Buccaneers are going to be pretty shitty this season, and they're going to be picking pretty high in the draft and have a chance at one of those top two quarterbacks in Caleb Williams or Drake May. But I personally, I'm not a big Chris Godwin guy. But I think, if the team that you have fits the mold of, hey, we have a chance to win now in the next couple of years, I think he's a good guy to have.
Yeah, and I think Godwin is, I want to say he's locked into Tampa for at least the next 2 years. Yeah, he's locked in through 2023 and 2024. So maybe the situation gets a little bit hairy there if they end up drafting a quarterback next year and it's somebody who's not ready to play immediately. Then maybe he's going to drop, outside of my top 30, maybe not outside the top 40 at that point. But for now, I think he's got at least one elite year left in him from a fantasy perspective.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Yeah, my wide receiver 22 was DJ Moore. So, Braden, if you want to kick us off with your wide receiver 21.
I'm going to go with Jerry Jeudy as my wide receiver 21. He feels like a guy who's a little bit underrated in the Dynasty community. I know last year I ended up trading him in a one-quarterback league and picked up Ramondre Stevenson, which turned out to be a win. But Jeudy still had a pretty nice season in his own right. Finished as the wide receiver 21, 100 targets, 67 catches, just shy of 1,000 yards, 6 touchdowns. So a respectable season all around, even if he didn't have any, super elite weeks by any means. And with Sean Payton coming to Denver, the Broncos offense would have to be at least a little bit better, right? It can't be much worse than last year. So Jerry Jeudy was kind of a staple of consistency last year. And if he can have, 2 or 3 of those 10 to 12 point performances that turn into 20 to 25 point performances, I think is going to have a very, very big year. Could be a low-end wide receiver 1.
Yeah, I've got Jeudy as my wide receiver 21 as well, funny enough, so great minds think alike. But, Braden, stop me if you've heard this before. I think this could be the year that Jerry Jeudy breaks out.
I might have heard that, once or twice or maybe 3 times. This might be the third time.
It might have gotten thrown around a couple times over the years, but Sean Payton has come out and said that Jerry Jeudy is going to be a big part of their offense. And I think with Denver's offense, there's not, a ton of talent in terms of pass catchers, but Jerry Jeudy at the same time is not quite in that range where he's going to be getting doubled on a consistent basis. And so, sure, he might be getting lined up with an opposing cornerback 1, but it's going to be single coverage. And I feel confident enough in his route running ability that he will be able to get open. And the 100 targets that he had last year are quite evident of that. The 113 targets he had as a rookie are quite evident of that. And it's possible that Courtland Sutton and or Tim Patrick are not on the roster next season. So that's just going to free up even more targets for him. I love Jerry Jeudy, and I think this could be his breakout year finally.
Yeah, I think all it really takes is some sign of a return to form for Russell Wilson. If he can be 75% of what he was for most of his time in Seattle, this Broncos offense is going to be significantly better than last year. And I think that it can support potentially 2 top 24 wide receivers, with one being Jeudy, one maybe being Sutton, maybe it's Tim Patrick, maybe it's Marvin Mims. So I think the Broncos offense, I don't know if I'd be like go by the Broncos offense, but I certainly would at least gauge the market at the very least.
Yep. Yeah, well said. Into the top 20 we go. Braden, who is your wide receiver 20?
I'm going to go with a 49ers wide receiver here, and it may not be the one you're thinking. It's going to be Brandon Ayuk from the San Francisco 49ers. I think Debo is ranked higher on Sleeper in terms of like their, I don't know if it's ADP or if it's like their own rankings or whatever, but I like Ayuk a little bit more. Last year he was the wide receiver 15 overall, had 114 targets, broke 1,000 yards for the first time in his career, and had 8 touchdowns. Everything is pointing towards a monster year from Brandon Ayuk, regardless of who's playing quarterback, whether that's Brock Purdy, whether it's Trey Lance, whether it's by some miracle Sam Darnold. The 49ers are going to throw the ball to him quite a bit because none of those guys are super, deep threat oriented receivers. And Brandon Ayuk is none of their other receivers are super like deep threat oriented. And that's where Brandon Ayuk thrives. Had over 13 yards per catch last year, had almost 15 yards per catch in 2021. And I think it was, I want to say the playoff game against Seattle. He had a couple of those big catches down the sideline for like 20, 30 yards.
Yeah.
So any balls that go deep are likely going to him. And while the 49ers aren't going to throw it deep a ton, most likely I would assume, they're going to throw it deep sometimes. He's going to gobble up all those opportunities. And I think he's a better wide receiver at this point in his career than Debo is. So I think that's kind of what breaks the tie for me in that offense.
Yeah, I've got Ayuk as my wide receiver 25, just right outside my top 24. And I actually just took him in a startup not too long ago as my wide receiver 4, which, side note, in the St. Thomas Lakeville League that we had start up not too long ago, my wide receivers, I'm not going to lie, not to toot my own horn here, they're absolutely stupid. Jamar Chase, Garrett Wilson, Devontae Smith, Brandon Ayuk, Treylon Burks.
Yeah, that's pretty good.
I am quite happy with that. But that is besides the point. I think everything you said is absolutely true with Ayuk, and reports so far this summer are that he's looking like one of the best players on the field in every practice. And I think we finally saw last year in his third season that, okay, Brandon Ayuk is as good as advertised. There's a reason this guy was a first-round pick. He was a high-end wide receiver 2 last season, finishes the wide receiver 15 overall. And after Brock Purdy took over, he threw the ball to Brandon Ayuk quite a bit. So I don't expect that to slow down at all. I think, like you mentioned, I think Ayuk is a better receiver at this point than Deebo Samuel. And it would not surprise me one bit to see Brandon Ayuk lead this team in targets in 2023.
Yeah, I think it might be a toss-up between him and Kittle for targets. But as far as wide receivers go, he's definitely going to lead the team in targets in that receiving room.
Yep. My wide receiver 20 is a rookie for the Vikings. It is Jordan Addison. And Jordan Addison figures to be the starting slot receiver for the Vikings this season. He was the Vikings guy going into the draft. And, I mean, just seeing the draft reactions from Kevin O'Connell and Kwesi, I mean, they're ecstatic to have this guy on the team. At Pittsburgh, as a sophomore, I mean, just an absolutely stupid season. I don't have the stats off the top of my head, but it was like 1,700 yards, like 16 touchdowns, just a stupid number. And then transferred to USC, led the receiving room there last year. So, ton of talent for Jordan Addison. Adam Thielen will leave behind 107 targets from last season. Jordan Addison expected to fill in most of those. Would not surprise me at all if he's the true second option behind Justin Jefferson in this offense. I know they have TJ Hawkinson as well, obviously. But I think Jordan Addison is going to be the true second option in that passing game. The one reason that I have him slightly behind my wide receiver 19, which is Quentin Johnston, is after this season, the quarterback situation is a little more uncertain than it is in Los Angeles. But from a player standpoint, I love Jordan Addison.
Yeah, I do too, and I have very similar rankings as well. I've got Addison as my wide receiver 18 and Johnson as wide receiver 19. So I think we can kind of get like a little comparison between the two here.
Yep.
For me, I think that I'm not 100% sold on Addison as a prospect. I like him more as a fantasy player, especially out of the gate, than I do Quentin Johnston. Regardless of the QB situation, I think that Addison's going to step into a bigger role initially, being the wide receiver 2 for the Vikings. All reports seem to say that he's going to beat out KJ Osborne for that second slot there. And with Justin Jefferson garnering so many double teams, it's going to leave a lot of opportunity for Addison to potentially even have a top 24 season at the wide receiver position as a rookie. I don't think the opportunity is quite there for Quentin Johnston out of the gate. I think that he might be a better receiver. I certainly think he has a better build at 6'4", 215 compared to Jordan Addison, which is 5'11", 173. And I've compared Quentin Johnston so many times to Mike Williams. I think that after this season, he takes over for Williams as that deep ball receiver, the guy who's going to break a bunch of tackles, make a bunch of contested catches. And I think he'll be a better NFL player than Addison down the line. But initially, I'm a little bit skeptical of his role in the Chargers offense year one. So I have Addison slightly higher from a dynasty perspective, and I would definitely have him higher from a redraft perspective.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. And looking at underdog ADP, Jordan Addison right now is going as the wide receiver 37, whereas Quentin Johnston is going as the wide receiver 42. And I would, like you said, I would expect, Addison to have a much bigger role year one. But looking ahead, I mean, Keenan Allen's going to be 32 next season, or 31, one of the two. He's going to be in his 30s. Mike Williams is getting up there. He's going to be 29. Austin Eckler is going to be 29 and probably not on the Chargers next season. Like, there's a real chance that Quentin Johnston is the wide receiver 1 for the Chargers next season. And, I mean, thinking about just this season, Keenan Allen missed time last year. Mike Williams, I don't think, has stayed healthy for a full season once in his entire career. It's possible that Johnston could have a bigger role this season than people think. So I like Quentin Johnston a lot. Obviously, he's a freak of nature athletically, but the reason I have him just slightly ahead of Addison is due to the future outlook.
Yeah, to me, this is truly a 50-50 toss-up. If I was going to do 10 startups, I would probably take each one of those guys 5 times if I had the opportunity.
Well
you
said.
Can't really go wrong with either of them. They have very similar ceilings, I would say. I think that Addison might have a slightly higher floor from a real-life perspective, but you can't go wrong with either of them personally.
Absolutely. And then, so that was your wide receiver 19 and 18, correct?
Correct.
All right. Then I will jump into my wide receiver 18, which is Davante Adams. Now, Davante Adams, I don't need to say it. He is consistently one of the best wide receivers in the NFL. Last season, everybody was saying, he's not with Aaron Rodgers anymore. He's done for. His 180 targets last season would disagree. Had 1,500 yards, 14 touchdowns, just absurd numbers. Finished as the wide receiver 2 overall. Would not necessarily expect that same result this season with Jimmy Garoppolo as his starting quarterback. At best, if Jimmy Garoppolo is able to play, because right now he is not fully healthy, I don't believe. So training camp will be interesting to see how that pans out. But the reason he's not higher is just because of the age. I mean, he's 30 years old. He'll be 31 midway through the season. But from a player perspective, he's consistently a top 5, if not top 3 receiver in the NFL and has been for the better part of a decade. So if you're a win-now team, Davante Adams is a guy who, if you're able to buy low on him, go out and do so, obviously. And then, with that, obviously, if you're a rebuilding team or, a team that's looking to get younger and, future capital, ship him off for, whatever you can get him for.
I've got Davante a little bit higher. He's one of those guys who have kind of, I don't know if I'd say he's immune to the age tax, which seems to hit a lot of those dynasty receivers around the age of like 28, 29, 30. But his production has shown no signs of slowing down whatsoever. Yeah. Since 2016, he's been at least the wide receiver 14 every season except for one, and in that year he played 12 games. The last 3 seasons, he's been the wide receiver 3, the wide receiver 2, and the wide receiver 1 going from 2022 to 2020. So, yeah, he's taking a little bit of a step back at quarterback, but at the same time, check out his target numbers from the past 5 seasons. In 2018, 169, 127 in 12 games in 2019, which puts him at like a 170-ish pace for the full season.
Yeah.
149 in 14 games in 2020, 169 in 2021, and 180 last year. The Raiders are just going to force feed him the ball. They don't have Darren Waller anymore. They might not have Josh Jacobs potentially. So who else in that offense is going to be able to carry this team? It's going to be Davante Adams. I think that he has a good 2 years left as a top 5 NFL wide receiver and a top 5 fantasy receiver as well. So I have him a little bit higher. I've got him as my wide receiver 12 from Dynasty, which it's a little bit high. I can understand that. But I'm all in on Davante Adams for the next 2 years.
Hey, don't sleep on Jacoby Myers. Big season coming. How dare you?
All right, well, hopefully people are watching that clip instead of listening to it, because otherwise it'll make no sense.
He was sleeping, for those who weren't aware.
I was going to leave that as an Easter egg and get people to watch, but thanks.
Damn it, Sam.
All right, moving on to wide receiver 17. I have Stephon Diggs here, who, unfortunately for him, is going to be affected by the age tax, despite playing in Buffalo with Josh Allen. And part of that has to do with the fact that he's unhappy for like the 4th time in his career already, for what seems like no reason. Last year had 154 targets, which is just shy of his career high of 166 in 2020 and 164 in 2021. But he put up 1,429 yards and 11 touchdowns. The 11 touchdowns being a career high. Like, I don't understand why he's unhappy in Buffalo, because the team is good. He's getting force-fed the ball. He's got a great quarterback. The team has, like, no rushing attack, so they have to give him the ball. I don't know. It just makes no sense to me. And the fact that he could be moved and the situation is almost certainly not going to get better kind of brings him down a little bit for me, and which is why, at least with Davante Adams, there's, some certainty. It's going to be Jimmy Garoppolo at quarterback, unless for some reason it's Aiden O'Connell, in which case I'll have to revise my rankings. But Stephon Diggs being unhappy. He's kind of a diva from what it seems like from the outside. I've got to put him as my wide receiver 17 from Dynasty rankings.
Yeah, I've got him as my wide receiver 15. So I'm pretty similar to you. And yeah, everything you said I think is completely true. He's been a wide receiver 1 the 4 of the past 5 seasons, and was a wide receiver 2 the other season. Really, there's not much that needs to be said about Stephon Diggs. If he's healthy, you know what you're going to get. He is the clear-cut number 1 option in Buffalo, and probably will be for the next few seasons at least. So, if kind of like the same thing with what I said about Davante Adams, if you're a contender, go out and get him, because he is going to be good, and that it's all but a guarantee.
Yeah, just curious why do you have Diggs a couple spots higher than Davante Adams? They're pretty similar players to me, and I can understand if it's that 2-year age gap making a huge difference from a dynasty perspective, but I think that Adams is just a better player. That's why I'd have Adams above. So I'm just curious to hear your reasoning.
Really, all it came down to for me was the quarterback situation. He's got Josh Allen compared to Jimmy Garoppolo at best. So for me, that's what did it. It has quite honestly, if it was a pretty similar quarterback situation, I think it would be probably one behind the other. I would can't say who that would be at the time, but as far as talent goes, they're very similar. I just think with Diggs' quarterback situation and the offense that he's in, that's what sets him a little bit above Adams for me.
Okay. Yeah, I'd say that's fair. Going back a little bit on your bet on the talent, not the situation with Michael Pittman, but obviously he's considerably younger, which makes a lot more sense to bet on the talent, because when you're getting guys who are 28, 29, 30, their situation is going to be what locks them in, because their talent's only going to get worse from there, you assume.
Yeah, and yeah, kind of going back on the other thing with the talent over situation. I think in a situation like this, you don't want to use it as, reason to have somebody higher if you don't have to. But in a situation where, okay, it's two very similar players, you can basically kind of just use it as a tiebreaker. And so for that reason, I have Diggs just a little bit higher.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that method as well. I just
Yeah.
have Devontae a little bit more highly because of I think his talent's a little bit better.
Yeah, I would
But
agree
you
with
can't
that.
go wrong with either, of course.
Absolutely. Then, yeah, my wide receiver 17 was Christian Watson. So, Braden, who is your wide receiver 16?
Sticking with the common theme of guys who are getting up there a little bit in age, we're gonna go with Cooper Kupp of the Los Angeles Rams. Kupp, he's up to what is he like 29 now? Is he 30? Is
He's
he
30.
30? Wow, I did not realize. He seems like he should be way younger.
Yeah.
But he was the wide receiver 23 last year, despite missing what was it, like 7, 8 games.
Yeah, he
He
played in
is just
9 games last season.
Yeah, he is a monster when he's on the field. Was the wide receiver 1 overall in 2021, led the Rams to a Super Bowl, and I think we've got another elite season out of Cooper Kupp if he can stay healthy. Last year had 98 targets in just those 9 games. Had 191 targets in 2021. Stafford loves to force feed him the ball, so I don't expect anything to change there. However, being 30 years old, I mean, yes, his game's not super predicated on athleticism like some of these other guys on this list, but it's going to hit him at some point, and I think we could see kind of an Adam Thielen type career for him in like 3 years from now because they both play similar roles. They're in the slot a ton, and if the Rams decide to draft a big number one X wide receiver in the next couple of drafts, which there's going to be a lot of good ones coming out soon,
Yep.
that could bump Kupp down quite a bit for me.
Yeah. Yeah, I've also got Kupp as my wide receiver 16. And going back to underdog ADP, he is currently being drafted as the wide receiver 3, right behind Jefferson and Chase. So the expectations for this year are rightfully very, very high. That's certainly where I would take him is wide receiver 3. And I mean, he's going to be getting force fed the ball, basically. It would not shock me one bit if he leads the league in targets this year. We've seen in the past that he can, handle that type of workload. 191 targets in 2021, the year where he put up 439 fantasy points, which is just ridiculous. So the one thing that would concern me just a tad with Cooper Kupp is the health of Matthew Stafford. But assuming that's not an issue, Kupp is going to have a probably top 5 wide receiver season at the very worst.
Yeah, and I think Kupp had some games last year where he was playing with like John Wolford. So I don't remember exactly when Stafford was injured, but I think he went down first. So even in
Yeah.
those games he still produced, still got, the lion's share of the targets from whoever was playing quarterback. So I'm not as worried about Stafford's injury potential affecting Kupp because I think he'll still be, a top 5, top 6 fantasy receiver, even if Stafford misses some time. For me, it comes down to more, will Cooper Kupp stay healthy? And if he does, he's a no-brainer to finish as a top 3 wide receiver in this season.
Yeah, and going back to the injury thing, Kupp actually went down a week before Stafford did.
Okay.
Yeah, Kupp went down week 10, Stafford went down week 11. So,
Okay, yeah. That
but
Rams
yeah, I
offense
mean,
was just a mess all year after that.
yeah, and I mean, even if Stafford had gone down first, I think you can assume that Kupp still would have had a monster workload.
Yeah. Moving on to wide receiver 15, I've got a couple of Seahawks here back to back. I'm going to start with DK Metcalf at 15. Last year, he was a popular sell candidate because, oh no, they're going from Russell Wilson to Geno Smith and Drew Lock. Get DK Metcalf off your team as fast as you can. And DK responded by setting a career high in targets with 141, a career high in receptions with 90, and while his yards and his touchdowns dipped a little bit from his career highs, he had a 1,300-yard season in 2020, and he had 1,048 last year, had 12 touchdowns in 2021, 6 last season. I'm not too worried about those. I think those numbers, with a full season of, a clear, concise plan in Seattle at quarterback, where it's Geno Smith 100% this season for the Seahawks. It's going to build a lot of chemistry. We saw that in the season. We're going to see that a bunch in the offseason, I'm sure, with all these videos and stuff that are coming out with guys throwing to their wide receivers in shorts, simulating, real NFL game action there with no pads. But I'm not worried about DK at all. He's the guy I'm betting on the talent 100% of the time. He'll be
Yep.
25 almost the entirety of the season. Has a beautiful 6'4", 235 frame. Perfect for those contested catches. And yeah, they brought in Jackson Smith and Jigba, but I think JSN takes more of the work from Tyler Lockett, especially going, into 2024, where I believe Seattle's a pretty easy out on Lockett's contract.
Yep.
Not 100% of that, but I think it's going to be those two guys teaming up to be, top 24 wide receivers in fantasy year in, year out for the next 4 or 5 years.
Yeah, you took the words literally right out of my mouth, talking about JSN taking Lockett's work rather than Metcalf's. So I have Stephon Diggs as my wide receiver 15. I have DK Metcalf as my wide receiver 14. And like you said, with betting on talent over the situation, perfect example. And with his touchdowns, obviously going from 12 in 2021 to 6 in 2022, I expect the touchdown numbers to come up quite a bit. I believe I saw some stat the other day that DK Metcalf was like top 3 in red zone targets last season. So I would fully expect that 6 to shoot up to potentially double figures. And he's got, the best deep ball quarterback from last season in Geno Smith throwing him the football. So I think especially in, half PPR and non-PPR formats, he has even more value than full PPR just because he's probably not going to be a guy who, catches 120 passes this season. But as far as, what you look for in a wide receiver, he has everything. He has not missed a game in his entire career. I should knock on wood right now. I'm going to do that real quick. Thank you. But yeah, I fully expect him to have another big year. And with JSN coming, I think that's going to be a great wide receiver duo for the years to come.
100%. And I'll segue over to JSN here because he's at my wide receiver 14. He is another one of those guys, similar to Jordan Addison, where I like a little bit more from a fantasy perspective than a real-life perspective, because I don't think JSN can ever be the number 1 wide receiver on an NFL team, but I think he has the potential to be the best number 2 wide receiver in the NFL. We've seen that at Ohio State, where he put up 1,600 yards as a sophomore in 2021, playing alongside Chris Olave and Garrett Wilson. But then last year, played in, I think, just 1 or 2 games, 5 catches, 43 yards before getting hurt. There were some rumors that he was opting out of the college football playoff and he wasn't actually hurt, which was thought might hurt his draft stock. Still ended up being the first wide receiver off the board to Seattle. And one of the interesting things with the Seahawks is that Pete Carroll has said that JSN is going to play outside of the slot a little bit. So it's interesting. I don't know if that'll be better or worse for his fantasy value because he'll obviously be going up against better cornerbacks there. But with DK Metcalf alongside him, I think that JSN is going to be open quite a bit. And Pete Carroll's a good offensive coach as well. So good scheming. JSN is a guy I really, really love for a monster year in year 2. I don't know if we're going to see in year 1 what we've seen with kind of a trend of these first-round wide receivers recently, where you have guys like Chris Olave and Garrett Wilson going for 1,000 yards last year, Jamar Chase having a big season as a rookie in 2021, Devontae Smith too, and then 2020 with Justin Jefferson, CeeDee Lamb, etc. I think that this wide receiver class is going to take a little bit longer to develop. I think that Addison's probably going to have the best rookie year out of any of these guys, but I think JSN is the best long-term from a fantasy perspective.
Yeah, I'll save a little bit of my JSN analysis for next episode because I have him inside my top 12. But I think, which going back to what you said about him playing outside the slot, I don't know that I like that because he's not exactly, a burner. I mean, I think he ran like a 4.57 or something like that at the combine. So it's not like, he's blazing fast, but his agility is just ridiculous. I mean, I think he put up like the 5th best shuttle scorer over the past like decade plus, which is just nuts. I think he's going to be a lot like what we saw with Amon-Ra St. Brown for the Lions. And if that's the case in year 1, I mean, that's sensational. The other argument that I've heard with him is, okay, well, they have 3 wide receivers now. Seattle doesn't like to run 3 wide receiver sets. He's worthless this year. Well, sure, they're not going to run 3 wide receiver sets when your wide receiver 3 is 32-year-old Marquise Goodwin. Sure, that's not going to happen. they didn't take him as the first wide receiver off the board in the first round to not use him. So, I mean, I don't fully get that argument, but I think he will certainly have to wait his turn this season behind Lockett and Metcalf. But yeah, looking forward to next year, I think he's going to be a really nice wide receiver too in that offense.
Yeah, and I think if you can get him, at 103 in the rookie draft behind Jahmyr Gibbs, absolute hammer that pick 100% of the time.
Yeah, and there's an argument to be made, take him over Gibbs.
Yeah. I think I lean Gibbs slightly, but it's another one of those similar to Addison and Johnston where it's really a 50-50 for me. I think Gibbs is going to be better out of the gate, but long term, obviously with wide receivers versus running backs, you're going to get more usage out of the wide receivers and more elite play, I would say. So I think I would lean Gibbs for now just because of that immediacy, but JSN is a great play too. So if you can get any assets basically to move off of one for the other, I would do it.
Yeah, the 103 is a great spot to be picking. That's what matters. You're getting either Gibbs or JSN. That's a perfect spot.
Yeah, and that's in non-Superflex leagues. In Superflex leagues, you're probably at like the 105 or the 106 between those guys.
Yep. Yeah. Well, yeah, DK Metcalf was my wide receiver 14. So, Braden, your wide receiver 13.
My final wide receiver this episode is going to be Tyreek Hill of the Miami Dolphins. I'm curious to see where you have him based on your trend of having kind of these slightly older wide receivers being a little bit lower. But Tyreek Hill last year, just unbelievable in his first year with the Dolphins. A career high in receiving yards with over 1,700. Had 119 catches, which was also a career high. And he ran for a touchdown as well. So, didn't run the ball a whole lot. It was a career low in carries, actually, with 7. But I'm not worried about that being something long-term. I don't think he's going to run the ball a ton this year. And, oh no, you're going to lose 6 fantasy points over the course of a full season by that. So, whoopee.
Don't draft him.
Yeah. The big question about Tyreek is he going to stay true to his word and retire after his contract ends? Because I think he's got 2 years left, I want to say, and was, contemplating retiring after that point. If he retires at that point at the age of 30, you are in a little bit of a panic mode if you have Tyreek Hill. However, you're still going to get 2 phenomenal seasons out of him. So I think it's worth a shot here at wide receiver 13.
Yeah, hang on, I'm just looking at Tyreek Hill's contract real quick. I believe it is up after 2025. I think he has 3 years left, if I'm not mistaken.
That third year is a team option, so that would make sense.
Okay, yeah, that sounds right.
I think I was listening to a Dynasty Nerds podcast episode about that like a month back, and they mentioned that.
Okay. But yeah, spoiler alert, I do not have Tyreek Hill as my wide receiver 13, so I will be talking about him a little bit more in part 2. But for the time being, I mean, he's a top 5 wide receiver for fantasy. I mean, on Underdog, he's going as the wide receiver 4 right behind Cooper Kupp. And a lot of times you see him go ahead of Cooper Kupp in drafts. I mean, their ADP is 0.7 picks off. So not a whole lot of separation there. With Tyreek Hill, his offense is going to be significantly better than the Rams offense will be. And I think the Rams offense will be better than people think it will be. But I think this Dolphins offense has a chance to be one of the best in the AFC this season. And that's high praise considering some of the offenses in the AFC. But
it relies on Tua staying healthy, really.
Yeah, that's very true. But yeah, if Tyreek Hill does retire after his contract is up, you still have 3 good seasons coming for him. And, kind of like what we've been saying earlier with the older wide receivers potentially hitting that age gap, I don't necessarily know that Tyreek Hill is someone you need to worry about that happening with, because Tyreek Hill is a speed guy. He's not a super physical wide receiver, so I don't think that you need to worry as much about the wear and tear as you would with, a Cooper Kupp or Devontae Adams. So for that reason, I have him slightly higher. I won't spoil it for now, but he is inside my top 12. And I think I'll save the rest of my analysis for that episode. So you'll have to stay tuned.
That seems fair to me. And I think before we go, the one thing I want to say is that sometimes age in Dynasty can be a little bit overrated. At the end of the day, you're playing for championships. If you have a guy who's, 31 years old versus a guy who's 28 years old, is that really that big of a difference? Because if they're playing at a similar level, right now, and your team has a 1 to 2 year window, it doesn't really matter. Like,
Yeah.
I don't know. I kind of lost my train of thought here, but I hope you can pick up on that because I don't know what else I'm saying, and I'm just rambling at this point.
Yeah. But moving on to my wide receiver 13, it is a guy who fits the theme of what we've been talking about this episode with bet on the talent over the situation. It's Drake London. As a rookie, as a number 8 overall draft pick and the number 1 wide receiver off the board in a good wide receiver class, he had 117 targets in a very run-heavy offense. Now, the one concern that you could potentially make with Drake London is a lot of his work came after Kyle Pitts was injured. I don't necessarily know how valid that is. I think, Drake London is about as talented as they come, and he's 21 years old, for crying out loud. At USC, I mean, he outproduced Amon-Ra St. Brown as a senior when he was, I believe, a sophomore, and he outproduced Michael Pittman Jr. when he was a sophomore. So the talent is absolutely there. It's just the scheme he's in doesn't necessarily play, to his strengths, which is being a wide receiver. But, 117 targets last season, 866 yards, 4 touchdowns. He is, I think, if he was in a better situation, he would probably be a top 10 Dynasty wide receiver just because he truly is insane. I've said it like 4 times now since I've started talking about him. Drake London is insane at football. It's ridiculous. So I love him. I just picked him up in one of our startups. So very happy for him. I know you traded up for him in one of our startups as well. So I'm very excited for what the future holds for Drake London.
Yeah, and I have Drake London a little bit higher, so I'm going to save most of my analysis for our next episode. But the one thing I do want to touch on here is I think Drake London is massively underrated compared to Garrett Wilson and Chris Olave. Yeah. To me, I don't think they're that far apart where, Wilson's going like late round 1, early round 2 in startups. Olave's at that, 2-3 turn. Drake London is usually going around like, I think it's like mid to late round 3 or 4, I think. And to me, I think he's very, very similar to Olave from a talent perspective. Yeah, his situation's a little bit worse, so I can understand maybe a couple spots different, maybe like a half a round, but not like a round and a half. So
yeah,
I think that Drake London should be much, much higher compared to those guys, and that's why I'm a big fan of him, and I like him as ADP.
Yeah, he's in best ball right now. He's going, as a wide receiver 2 for just this season. Right in between Christian Watson and Terry McLaurin. So if that's where he's going this year, I would assume he's only going to get better, and so that's someone I want on my team.
Yeah, the time to buy Drake London is now because you're not going to be able to buy him any other time.
Yep, well said. But ladies and gentlemen, that is going to do it for today. Thank you for joining us. We hope you enjoyed, and we will catch you in the next one.
Adios.